All right, as you know, this is the third panel in a series of 3 panels on labor and global supply chains, organized by Yanwan and Chunyun. And this third panel is on macro social programs to improve social performance. We have 4 papers in this session, so we're really going to stick tightly to the 10-minute presentations, followed up by a discussion by Anil, and then any question and answers. So I'm going to jump right into it with the first presentation by Mark Anner. Go ahead, Mark.
Great, thank you, Kelly, and I'll jump right into it as well here. So I get that going all right here. Whoops. Okay. So yes, so this draws on some kind of my pandemic research in Honduras that I've been doing for the better part of the past year. And as part of my bigger project, really just looking at this question of labor governance. And the last panel, we're talking a lot about the power imbalances. So, you know, my big picture observation is, well, then what are the real strong dynamics that are going to most reshape those power imbalances, and arguing that it's context specific. So what happens in Vietnam versus Bangladesh versus Honduras is going to be very different. But let me talk about the Honduras case. It's probably one of the cases I'm the most excited about. And the way I frame it here in my title is, labor governance, achieving decent work through the interaction of what I call global binding agreements with encompassing collective bargaining. So the dilemma for bargaining in global supply chains is, we know, one of the most effective, equitable, sustainable solutions is collective bargaining. And I highly, highly recommend the new ILO report. Susan Hayter was the lead author on that, but a huge team worked on that on collective bargaining. But what do we do in the case of global supply chains when most value and power lies outside national borders of the producing countries? And this tentative answer is combining these two. And I see this ILO work, and there's all this work, and my colleague Jen Baer and Jeremy Blassie and others have been looking at these co-governance agreements, and I'm sort of trying to see how these things might fit together. That's the cover of the report. And there's a talk on it tomorrow at 12:15 if one of the authors will be doing that. So this, I'm going to go quickly with this. This is sort of, we're bargaining here on this upper right-hand corner, the employers who get their share and labor who's fighting for their share, but most of the value is outside the chain. So how do we kind of connect these two pieces? And this is what I'm arguing. I use the term global binding agreements. Other common terms might be worker-driven social responsibility or enforceable brand agreements, but they're all basically the same. There's some degree of negotiation, there's co-governance, there's some sort of arbitration binding component to it. And of course, I think in this group, everyone knows the importance of collective bargaining. So here's the Honduras case, a quick kind of 12-year review of this. 2008, factory Russell Brands, which is part of Fruit of the Loom, has a factory named Jersey, major labor issues, attempts to organize, death threats, in fact, against the workers. The factory is closed down. It's argued this was to avoid the union. Major campaigns, USAS, WRC, worker tours, and eventually we get something in 2009 they call the Washington Agreement. It's legally binding. It's with Fruit of the Loom. In that agreement, they agree to reopen the factory, to recognize the union, and that they will, in good time and in good faith, start collective bargaining. And they're going to provide unions access to all their factories in Honduras and do training. At the time, Fruit of the Loom, directly owned factories in Honduras, is the largest private sector employer. So this is a very important agreement. There's a side agreement with the Worker Rights Consortium, a labor advocacy group based in DC, that Fruit of the Loom commits to neutrality. It will not in any way actively campaign against efforts to unionize. 2010, the factory opens. They call it Jersey Nuevo Dia, New Day. 18 months, bargaining is never easy. 18 months later, they signed their first collective bargaining agreement. A lot of folks on this call probably know a good part of that story. Here's the part that I'm looking at. 10 years later, There are now 22 major collective bargaining agreements, and they cover 44% of the garment workers. I feel the major garment exporting countries, it's without question the highest rate of collective bargaining globally. So what do we do methodologically? This is just to give you a sense of it. These are the 22 agreements. They cover, it starts with Fruit of the Loom, but you have Hanes Brands, you have Delta Apparel, you have Gildan, Activewear, Canadian company, you have Honduran suppliers, El Catex is a really big one. You have a factory called Tegar, which is huge and a main supplier for Nike. So what do we do methodologically? The first step was we collected every single one of these collective bargaining agreements. We created a baseline of the labor code, vacation pay, maternity leave, and we coded every single clause in every one of these bargaining agreements and created a data set. Do I have that next? Yes. So here's from the data set, just a couple of points. 16 of them have education funds, 11 have paid vacation beyond the law, 18 provide school supplies, 14 provide additional maternity leave, 11 have paid paternity leave. 20 of the 22 stipulate specifically monthly meetings between management and union representatives to discuss all sorts of working conditions, production targets, labor relations, and so on. A very crucial aspect of these. I've been working on this for a while. I started this a few years ago, and when I did research in the banana sector in Guatemala, what I'm calling worker-driven research to complement sort of worker-driven social responsibility, where we're training worker advocates in basic survey techniques. We do a lot of practice, but driven, you can think of community engaged research or community-driven research. The driven part means that they were involved in designing the research question and they were engaged in doing the survey. This is a photo of them actually doing this. These are workers, I mean, shop stewards, activists, unionists, all of them at one point worked in garment factories, and probably a third are actively working in the factories and have some times off because they're shop stewards. Again, involved in the design, implementation, and analysis. We worked on this throughout the fall. We met every Tuesday evening for about 2 hours designing this. And during this time, I managed to go to Honduras twice. I just got back last week where I was presenting these findings. So quick impact from now the survey, and this is not the text analysis, but the actual survey, we find an overall wage premium collective bargaining agreements of 6%. We actually had 3 sectors in this. They call it the maquila sector, so manufacturing exports. Wire harnesses, in Spanish they say arneses, it's auto parts, it's the wire components that go into vehicles, garments, and actual textile mills. We see the most significant impact was of bargaining agreements was in textiles, which makes sense because it's more capital intensive. It's about 9% wage premium there. It was about 4% in garments. And we see significant reduction in the gender wage gap to 2% from 6%. That's just in garments. We also found that workers not covered by collective bargaining agreements were 20% more likely to face verbal abuse. Female workers who were not covered by collective bargaining agreement were 11% more likely to face sexual harassment on the job. And importantly, when the cases where there was sexual harassment in these unionized workplaces with collective bargaining agreements, female workers covered by agreements reported that there were 120% more likely to have a valid mechanism at work for addressing gender-based violence and harassment. Just some quick questions that we asked along the way. A lot of these questions, we're studying all these collective bargaining agreements, but basically, if you had a collective bargaining agreement versus not, you were much more likely to have voluntary overtime, very, very much more likely to have a subsidized lunch and free transportation to work, savings and loans account. And very interestingly, a very high percentage saying if you had a collective bargaining agreement, work intensity was not increasing one year to the next. And again, go back to that almost all of them have monthly meetings where production targets are a subject of bargaining and discussion. The other point we asked was about work-related reasons for wanting to migrate. Not surprisingly, low salaries was a big concern. Abusive treatment, 10%, high production targets. People, you could have multiple answers, so keep that in mind when you look at this. Long work shifts, debt, and violence. A lot of violence, and usually in transportation to and from work. And one key finding we had from this, we found that workers covered by collective bargaining agreements were 25.3% less likely to want to migrate to another country relative to workers who were not covered by collective bargaining agreements. Beyond this, I'm looking at the time here too. Unions, as they became stronger, they also bargained over minimum wages for the entire sector. They came up with a 5-year agreement, 7.5 to 8% per year, accumulated increase of 45% over this period. And lastly, I'll end with this slide. What I see happening here is, go back 10 years ago, the global binding agreement was really the driving force, and collective bargaining was relatively rare. 10 years forward, the bargaining agreement is becoming less important, and the global binding agreement and collective bargaining is taking over, which in my view is exactly what you want. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Oh, really interesting. Thanks, Mark. Okay, next up is Chunyun.
Okay, so I will just go straight into the presentation. So Sarosh and Raymond and me have been analyzing the impact of public disclosure of social audits on government suppliers. And so in this presentation, I'm going to present some preliminary results on our new analysis of potential unintended impact of such public disclosure program and the role of suppliers' management system in mitigating such unintended impact. So activists has long pressured global companies to publish information on their global suppliers. And Nike and H&M did publish the names of the suppliers and social performance on their websites. And collectively, Fair Labor Association and Better Work also published social audits results, as many of us here know. And the government, many governments are trying to also to leverage transparency to improve standards in the global supply chains. So in order to understand how does these programs impact behaviors of the disclosed companies, we draw on the reactivity theory. So reactivity is the idea that people tend to change their behavior when they are being measured, and they tend to conform to the metrics they are used to measure their behavior. So in the private regulation context, so this public information on the social performance of the factories potentially can impact the individual consumers and global buyer. And this impact on these external resources potentially can encourage the global buyers or the supplier factories to improve performance on these public standards. And another way that this public information can encourage performance can be through reallocation of internal resources from these areas they are not reported to the public measures. So classic studies about how the university rankings impact universities shows that the resources are reallocated from other source area to improve, let's say, job performance or library books, because these are the measures they are reported in the ranking. So this so for us, we try to analyze potential resource allocation within the supplier factories to provide more evidence, in addition to the few studies that are done by Raymond, which shows that the Better Works transparency program tend to result in improved compliance in general. But we want to test whether there are resource allocation within the company from those standards that are not measured or reported in the public domain to these public metrics. And so, so in order to understand the interplay between the public measures and internal factors, we extend the reactivity theory by distinguishing this external reactivity to public measures from internal reactivity. That's the idea, to conform to organizational policies and measures. And as many people in this field, there are standard HR policies or industrial relation policies that tend to influence the behavior of the managers and supervisors. And so we argue that the supplier's management system will include normally these internal policies, performance indicators, and processes that can induce this internal reactivity or conformance to a wider set of standards and measures beyond those standards that are reported in the public domain. In such a way, this brand management system will be able to a certain extent, constrain the resource allocation from unreported area to reported area, and also help the organization to perform better in the unreported area. So we would test two main sets of hypotheses. One is about the external reactivity. So we test the hypothesis that factories will improve faster on those publicly in disclosed standards than the non-disclosed standards. So in such a way, there will be a larger gap between compliance with disclosed standards and non-disclosed standards after public disclosure program. But the management systems will be able to constrain and narrow the compliance gap when the manufacturers have a higher or stronger management system. So we draw on the data from BetterWorks transparency portal, which went live in 2017. It reported the names of the factories and also the specific numbers. There are issues that are violated among the 26 core labor standards. It covered the factories in 5 countries. And they examined the compliance with the 26 core disclosed standards and another 170 non-disclosed standards, and compare the differential compliance between 2017 and 18. So we have over 1,000 audits in two years, and we assume that the factories will react to this public disclosure pressure in 2018. And the compliance, it was measured by the share of compliant items among total items in the particular category. So this average information shows that except Haiti, in all the other 4 countries, compliance with the public disclosed standards tend to be higher than the non-disclosed standards. And also the compliance gap tend to be larger in 2018 compared to 2017. In terms of the management system, we can think of this as a more compliance-based HR system. There are 13 items that were used to create this index. These are standard procedures about recruitment, termination, grievance, or accountability systems, and the similar procedures and investigation or communication about organization health and safety issues. So standard procedures to guide the manager's behavior. So these are the results for the first hypothesis about compliance with disclosed and non-disclosed standards. So as you can see in the first column, compared to 2017, in 2018, the factory tend to improve much faster in the compliance with the disclosed standards. But the improvement is not significant for the non-disclosed standards. And the wild test comparing the 2 sets of coefficients show that they are statistically different. So the factory tend to improve much faster in 2018 for those standards that are reported on the public portal. Regarding the compliance gap, as you can see in the first column, in 2018, the compliance gap also was significantly larger after 1 year of the transparency portal. And the interaction term between this year and the factory's management system is negative. And as you see in this plot, in 2017, the association between management system and compliance gap was not significant. In 2018, when the factories all improved in the public disclosed standards, the factories that have better management system tend to have lower compliance gap, supporting our hypothesis that this management system will constrain the resource allocation or help to improve the compliance with the non-disclosed standards. So in summary, from 2017 to 18, the improvement in the disclosed standards are faster, and also there was a larger compliance gap after the public disclosure program, and the management system narrow this compliance gap. So the same pattern was also found among the 400 factories that have repeated audits. So our assumption in this preliminary analysis is that the factories only reacted to the impact of this public disclosure in 2018, but the impact can be already, let's say, effective in 2017. In that case, our estimates could be more conservative, and we are now more analyzing data with more years to provide more rigorous tests. And that's why your comments on methods or theory or how to think about this can be very helpful for our project. Thank you.
That's great, Chunyun. Thank you. And it's nice to see the work that you guys are doing together, building on expertise with private regulation and transparency and all that. So next up, we have Raymond, who's going to be talking on labor compliance and trade flows.
Thank you all very much. Yeah, it's great to see everyone, even virtually. It's such a great community, and it's an honor to be here with you. I realize we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try and stick very closely to the point and the time. Can everyone see this okay? Does this look okay? Great, thanks, Mark. So this is about labor compliance and trade flows broadly. This is a very macro paper, so I'm the macro part of the session's title, maybe. The main point is that I'm trying to argue here is that the policy debates, a lot of them center around trade flows and how do trade flows respond to improving compliance in developing countries. So there's a pretty large literature and growing on labor standards and trade agreements. There's a new ILO database that I'd like to also promote here that does a great job of pulling together the labor standards and trade agreements that provides lots of resources. I see that Damien's also been participating in the sessions and was a co-author. He's done some really great work on some of the labor standards and trade agreements, and along with Daniel Simon and Desiree Leclerc have been working on estimating some of those effects. But overall, the results suggest very limited, if any, negative effects on average trade flows, and maybe even some positive effects. So having labor standards in these trade agreements might actually be trade promoting, but there might be some negative effects tied to how efficiently those enforcement mechanisms are in place and working in those agreements. And there isn't a lot of enforcement, but when there is enforcement, there might be some negative effects, but overall, the relationships are generally positive for the agreements on the whole. Now, this is actually really relevant to the discussion today because improving labor standards isn't necessarily something that follows from trade agreements, right? So this sort of leaves open the question of whether or not these trade agreements are effective in improving labor standards. So there's another debate on if trade agreements may or may not be effective. What are some of the optimal policies to improve compliance in developing countries? So we know that trade is linked to economic development, and we see higher wages across the board on the micro and macro level with exports. And we also know that compliance at the firm level, and this is a nod to Matt and Greg's paper along with Tobin in 2020, right, about this missing middle, shows that compliance at the firm level might not lead to higher purchases, right? So this actually raises this question about the aggregate effects, right? Does compliance improving compliance lead to more trade or not in the aggregate relationship? So that's the second motivation, is looking at the macro part. The third one is that a big part of better work, advertising and promotion rests upon this claim of increases in trade flows. So a lot of the marketing rests on the idea that if you adopt better work, you'll increase exports as a country, and they want to appeal to domestic governments with this argument. But as far as I know, and hopefully someone here can correct me, but that remains formally untested. So we're going to test that with this paper. And secondly, you want to focus on better work because unlike other programs, the relationship with compliance is well established and positive. So we're using better work as a proxy for what happens when you improve working conditions in the factories and how that affects aggregate trade. So just to get right at it, I'm going to try and leave you with a very simple message about this, that there's a very strong relationship between participating in better work and improving trade. How do I get there? Well, as I said, just giving you a background on the theory, the main assumption is that better work is improving compliance. I think that's pretty well established in the literature. And I'm not even bothering with this audience to tell you what better work is. But increasing labor compliance can either increase or decrease aggregate trade flows, depending on firm survival effects. So we have a paper on that. Marginal firms might stop exporting when costs increase. But there might also be demand effects on the other side, right? Buyers might overall increase their sourcing from a country with improved compliance. And also shifting supply between countries based on these compliance perceptions, right, might also be a factor. So we're gonna sort of look at just the aggregate net effects within what's called the gravity model. I know that a lot of you are not trade economists, but most of you probably have heard of this. It incorporates other variables that also affect trade across countries over time, like, distance, GDP, that sort of thing. And I'm also including the effects of trade agreements per se, because this is part of a much larger project I have on the relationship between trade agreements on apparel trade specifically, and I'd love to talk more about that maybe in the discussion section. So the data on the empirical approach are very straightforward. We're using ComTrade data, pairwise total trade, both for total trade and apparel trade between all country pairs. The empirical approach is a Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood approach, a pseudo Poisson maximum likelihood approach with fixed effects and cluster standard errors, and it's got a difference in difference approach that identifies the impact of entering better work, not just being a better work country per se. So jumping right to the main results, there's two things I'd like to emphasize here. Number one is that if you look at the upper right-hand corner, the overall effect of being in better work, and this is the effect of, that emerges after you join better work, is strong and positive and significant. So the main message from this talk is basically that there's a strong, positive, statistically significant relationship between apparel exports in your country and joining better work. Now that is obviously controlling for the better work countries. So that's the second line here, especially on apparel value, is that the better work countries tended to be apparel exporters, which we've already heard a little bit about in the earlier sessions from some others. So we know that these are apparel exporting countries, but the top line then gives you the marginal effect of better work. Now, I've included the trade agreements. There's other variables that are included, obviously, and we have a couple 100,000 observations. But the magnitude of the better work effect is larger across the board than the effects of trade agreements. And for those of you who, Damien and others who have looked at the effects of trade agreements on trade, realize that these are monster effects that are outside the bounds of most normal estimation. The normal estimation of a trade agreement is 10 to 20%. This is like 45%, and we can talk about why that might be. But the better work is even larger than that. And it's not quite double, but it's much more significant. So just to explore some of the robustness in the kind of 3.5 minutes I have left here, is that when we restrict the sample to the 4 largest major exporters, which are Canada, the EU, Japan, and the United States, we still get the same effects, right? So that the apparel effect on apparel trade is large and significant, and this is still even compared to the better work countries, and it's not quite as large as the trade agreement effect, but it's comparable in magnitude. Now, at this point, I do want to hesitate and draw your attention to these total trade effects, that the total trade effects are largely insignificant. So being in better work doesn't affect total trade. So we're not just picking up some sort of, distance or other type of domestic supplies, subsidizing electricity or something like that, that might be related to overall trade. This is clearly an apparel effect. And since apparel is something that's specifically addressed in better work, we can kind of rule out those other country effects. And the better work countries in general are not countries that trade a lot of other things, right? So trade is generally less with those countries. So the trade agreements do have an effect on total trade, but in some of these cases, they have an average effect on apparel, which is even larger. The last robustness check run in this estimation was just looking at US imports only, and this is going to be probably the only cautionary thing, the only cautionary message from my presentation is that here, if you look at this is total trade value. So economists would think about this as price times quantity. But what we do in the next 2 columns is we break out the quantity and the prices separately to see kind of what's happening with quantities and prices. And clearly there's, for the United States, right, entering into better work, this is the marginal effect of entering in better work, has a very, very large effect. on total trade value. But the main thing that the next column tells us is that that overall effect is primarily coming from quantity, right? So we're definitely increasing the quantity of apparel. And this is what's the disturbing part. And I see Mark's eyes kind of light up when he sees this, right? Because there's definitely some concerns about the values, the unit values. And this is sort of the proxy for either quality or upgrading or sort of the kind of apparel that's being produced. And that is, this is representing clearly that it's lower value type of goods, you know, t-shirts and definitely lower on the apparel quality ladder. And that doesn't really seem to improve over time. If anything, sort of the average unit values are going down after they enter better work. So they're kind of concentrating in those low wage kind of, or, you know, low priced kind of garments. So just to kind of wrap up, I realize I have just less than a minute left and I want to make sure that I'm complying. Otherwise, Kelly might talk to me later. But the main message here is that better work is strongly associated with increases in apparel exports, whether that's in the United States or the major importers or around the world. And so this is clearly consistent with those marketing claims that better work is made. The implication here, though, that I would like to draw and at least try to be a little bit provocative for the panel is that compliance is not discouraging aggregate exports, right? So for these countries that are resisting kind of increasing compliance, that doesn't seem to be reducing trade in any way. But it is also consistent with this idea that compliance increases some of those micro performance measures, some of the work that we've done on survival and firm performance, or that costs are not rising faster than revenues for producing firms. So it's actually producing some positive effects at the firm level. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Next up, we have Jeff, who's going to bring it to a practitioner perspective, I believe, and tell us a little bit about what he's working on. Jeff. You need to unmute yourself, Jeff. Sorry about that.
I apologize for that delay. I'm keeping a close watch on the clock, so I'll give you a very quick overview of the project, and hopefully it'll leave some room for a conversation. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, you can go to presenter view probably if you want, but we can see it.
Great. Give me. Yeah. Let's just leave it like that. Easier for me. Okay, just in brief, I'm going to touch on a few key aspects of the project and what we're doing here. These are the areas I'll touch on. So just very briefly, this is the Global Trace Protocol that's run by Elevate. Elevate has been acquired by LRQA, which is spun off of Lloyd's Register. So Elevate focuses on social responsibility in global supply chains, and LRQA has a much wider ambit. And the Global Trace Protocol is funded by the US Department of Labor. So I'm heading up this project. It's one specific sliver of what Elevate is doing and the one part that is funded by the US government. So we're funded for a period of 4 years and the amount of $4 million. And the aim here is reducing child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking in global supply chains with a focus on improved traceability. So it's structured a little bit differently. We have outputs identified rather than objectives, but the goal here is improving downstream tracing of goods and materials to help eliminate child labor and forced labor within supply chains. And these 3 outputs. One is increasing, it's odd that they have this as increasing the number rather than the quality, but we're trying to do both. Increasing the number of tested supply chain tracing methodologies, which has to do with labor rights as well as tracing the goods, focused on cotton in Pakistan and cobalt in the DRC. The second is increasing the number and the availability of the tracing tools themselves. And these are 2 very different tools for cobalt in the DRC and for cotton in Pakistan. And then the final input is increasing the dissemination of the tools, collaborating with others in the field, and testing our hypothesis and moving forward on that basis. There's some kind of bigger issues, ideas that I'll quickly identify. One is we have really rapidly evolving technology. Now that I'm on the private sector side, I see how rapid it's changing. It's hard to keep up with. And we have very complex and very shifting supply chains. And one of the big challenges is moving from this plethora of industry-specific proprietary tools, supply chain due diligence tools, to a commodity agnostic public platform, which is what is one of the targets of the project. Is we'll start with the traceability tools and then move towards a public platform with some broader tools for traceability and due diligence. I won't unpack or get into the chain of custody models, but it's important in supply chain management, whether we're doing mass balance or identity preservation, other concepts that are really key here to due diligence. A key issue that I know you're familiar with is the challenges of identifying what data we would like to collect and what we realistically can collect. And then also what I see on the supply chain side is some really sophisticated analytical tools. My issue is the quality of data that goes in them. You know, particularly if you're looking at child labor, forced labor, hazardous working conditions on a farm in Pakistan or in a mine in the DRC. So we don't want to be misled by the precision of the numbers with the analytical systems unless we have some confidence in the data that's going into these systems. And then what counts? There's a lot going on here. And I'll say just in brief that the pressure from the rollout of the European due diligence requirements. Even in Japan, we're going to see the due diligence guidance, not mandatory, coming out at the end of July. And then the rollout of the work release orders on forced labor, goods made with forced labor by CBP has had a really profound impact on brands and their interest in traceability and supply chain due diligence. Now we're in the middle of, or a bit into year 2. So we don't yet have results to show. We are completing the design of the traceability tools, particularly in Pakistan, and we're going to be implementing soon those tools. Very briefly, we do have a website that's up, a web page up, and we have this traceability glossary that is now posted, and we're soon going to have a context analysis up, context of traceability and labor rights with a more of a global focus. That will soon be up within a couple of weeks. And also a mapping report for the cobalt supply chain is also going to come up soon. And then we're completing our Pakistan cotton mapping report too. That will all be up within the next couple of weeks. Traceability, I'm not going to unpack this too much. Yes, there are some important differences between traceability versus mapping. Tracing, where you are actually tracing the goods, and then linking that through various tools to labor rights, versus mapping, meaning identifying your suppliers. Cotton is a very different supply chain from cobalt. Cotton is a very important part of Pakistan's economy. I have noted here that they have their new textile and apparel policy that just was implemented with energy supports that they had just rolled back because of IMF conditionality. So cotton is very important. It's been very volatile, both in the production numbers and in the price in the market. It's gone up a great deal in the past year. One of the challenges for traceability is the number of farms. There's a lot of farms. 90% of cotton production is at very small farms, very informal. And though there are laws prohibiting child labor and bonded labor, they don't really apply. They're not enforced at the farm level, and it's really hard to do so. And a lot of people are not aware of the lack of administrative implementation at the farm level. Traceability tool. One thing I'll notice about the note about the cotton tiers is at the spinner levels where we have the imports. When there was a real impact, a negative impact from floods and then droughts on the cotton production in Pakistan a year or two ago, there were a lot of imports that came in. So now there's a big issue with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which is identifying, dealing, addressing with potential imports from China. Since we now have a flipped burden on affirmatively showing that cotton coming in from from China is not made with forced labor. And there's no de minimis standard here. So that's a real issue for the importation of cotton and for the ability to map and to trace cotton to make sure that it's coming from Pakistan. There's some real important technological challenges that we're facing. These are the stages. I won't go into any great detail here. Cobalt is very different because 60+% of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. We've heard President Biden, announced an interest in reducing cobalt, but that's not what's happening in the next 5 to 10 years. The demand for cobalt has increased enormously in the past 5 years. And it's a very complex environment that taps into what's going on with the semiconductor supply chain. And then dealing with the issues of what happens at the mine level versus the crude refiner, and then the refineries, 80% of which are in China, a small number in India and in Western Europe as well. So being able to trace a product throughout the entire supply chain is really difficult at some of the choke points. So our partners in implementation in Pakistan are RMI, the Responsible Mineral Initiative from RBA, and also RCS Global. Diginex is helping us do the design and the tool, which we are really creating of whole cloth for Pakistan. So just dissemination, we have a web page. We're going to be posting our resources. And those include this, as I mentioned, the glossary, the context report, the cotton and cobalt reports. And then we have these constructive outputs, the refined protocols and related lessons, the traceability tools, and then ultimately this commodity agnostic traceability tool and platform, which will be an iterative discussion to improve, to evaluate and improve as we go. Thank you.
Wow, this is going to be so useful for such a variety of stakeholders. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Anil, who's going to provide a bit of a discussion on the papers, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So you can feel free to put your questions over there in the chat.
Thank you, Kelly. I will try to be brief so you can have time for some questions. There are 4 papers, so even if I did 2 minutes each, that was like 8, but let me see if I can compress. So let me just do them in a somewhat different order. I'd like to talk about Raymond's paper first, then Mark Anner's, and then the Lee paper with her co-authors and Jeff at the end. So Raymond, in your study, very interesting. One thing that was not clear to me, and perhaps you can clarify after I finish, is your variable in better work. Does that mean that you are able to identify that portion of the apparel trade that came from factories that are in better work? If that is so, then this is very useful data. I didn't know that we could get the data so granular that it could be traced back to better work factories. The whole idea of following better work and similar experiments is that even though we are targeting a small share of the workforce, that there are considerable spillover effects within the country. And I think your results kind of imply that because you find a similar effect for whether they're in better work or they're from a better work country. One other issue that I would like to point out is that, better work was not randomly assigned to apparel factories exporting from those countries. So there were factories that were producing at the high end, and our brands from the West were interested in output of these factories. So these factories were encouraged to join better work. So a better test would be if we had better work and non-better work factories compared to see whether in fact the non-better work factories are much less likely to export anyway, because they don't produce the same quality or the same caliber of products. And the other confusion I see a little bit in the model, one of identification, is that generally the choice of better work, of locating better work, is a bit complicated. You know, in some cases, in some countries, the export was already underway and better work followed the export patterns. In other cases, there were newly emerging production centers and better work was targeted there. So how do we separate this pattern that followed is not clear to me. Another test I would recommend that you do with your data is that different countries joined better work in different years. So it kind of sets up a event type study where you could look at years immediately before and after better work was introduced, and that might give you some more insightful results. About Mark's paper, it's a great paper, Mark. I think there are two interesting things there for me. One is that collective bargaining does improve conditions of work, which is something that we know already, but it's nice to see that confirmation. But a more important picture that you paint with your paper is that we are bargaining over a little sliver of the total share of the pie, whereas the big chunk is already hived off at another location where workers have no say, no representation. And I'm reminded of these fair trade programs, like in coffee and in a number of other commodities, where there's a move to return more of the gains of the product back to the workers, back to the farmers. So the question that arose for me is there a similar movement or effort in the area of garments? And I think there is a program, Jeff can speak to this, that at one time the US DOL said that they want to work with companies on this idea that more of the value that consumers pay should be returned to workers at source. So for agriculture products, for cotton, for coffee, and so forth. Okay, let me now go over quickly to Chunyun's paper. And this asks a very important question: does disclosure make a difference? And I did not see you cite the ethics literature, but I think there is some research there that clearly says that disclosure makes people more ethical. So you may want to integrate your work with that. And at first I thought that, you know, this would be difficult to disentangle because there is a simultaneity in better work being adopted, being put through over the years, and the disclosure coming over time. So there's a kind of compounding of time with disclosure. And even if you didn't include disclosure, these factories would have improved over time in their compliance. But I think that the authors have used a very interesting natural experiment that occurs there between disclosed standards and non-disclosed standards. And I think this is where your result is stronger, because you are showing that there's a difference there as well. The only question I have for you there is, were the disclosed standards and the non-disclosed standards randomly distributed, or was there a bias in the way they were selected? So it may just be that the disclosed standards were the more important ones and they were chosen for disclosure. And then the ones that were not chosen were less important. So you may just want to think about that potential bias. And the other point I want to make is the same as I made a short while ago, is that if disclosure of different standards came at different times or at different times for different countries, then you may want to use a test which uses the repeated treatment test. That is before, after each disclosure event. And then if you can show that there is a significant change, then you have a much stronger test of that idea. Lastly, about Jeff's paper, very interesting, very happy to see that you are spending some money on tracing, certainly tracing and targeting, but unless it's combined with disclosure, it will not have the intended effect. So let's connect the themes here. So trace all you want, but you must disclose, it must be public. The other thing I was a little bit blind to, and I don't read this literature so much, is do we know anything about what works in this area from other prior experiences of tracing? Because I can follow the logic that you develop these tools, but who will use these tools? Will it be this firm, or will it be local government officials or NGOs? And there lies the real point about execution. Unless you have the personnel and the institutional framework, just developing the tools is not likely to make a big difference. And we know this from our own debate of national versus international interventions. We know that many international interventions fail because they don't have the local institutional support. Lastly, let me end by making one of my own pet points, which is that in all the research that we are doing on supply chain and tracing and targeting products back to their factories and improving standards there, is that the footprint of all these efforts is quite rather small when you look at it from the other end. So if you look at Pakistan or India or DRC, what you are targeting is a very small share of their total workforce. So is this a good strategy is a question that I'd like everyone to address. And the answer is yes, at one level it is, because it's targetable and what is doable gets done. But shouldn't the focus be on targeting the national system of labor standards within these countries so that you would have the foundation on which international efforts can be, where international efforts can add to their own national efforts. So without that movement, it seems to me that we should be spending our money in countries where there is a stronger institutional base so that your investment can have better returns. So let me stop there.
Thanks very much, Anil. Why don't we work backwards, Jeff, since one of the last questions was posed to you, and then there's also a question in the chat from Drusilla about elaborating further on your big impact of the WROs, and if you could be more specific.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll do my best to be concise. So first, partly on Anil's point, is traceability is one tool among others that it has to be understood in context. And I long have argued that you have to do multiple things. It's one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of really interesting, good efforts on traceability that are incomplete and proprietary, and it's moving, it's opening up. And I'm seeing that a lot more in cotton. They're getting better by leaps and bounds, but there are weaknesses in the system. Who uses them to what end? And how do you make this sustainable is a big issue. And so that's an issue for us, moving towards a commodity agnostic tool. How is this sustainable, and how do the stakeholders involved act? The governments and unions are really important stakeholders, and they are even weaker than I thought at many key parts of the supply chain. So I'm a firm believer in building unions up, and they're very weak in both the countries we're in for what we're focusing on. In terms of WROs, so this is the Tariff Act of 1930, which prohibits the importation of goods made by forced labor, which was a footnote, like when I teach a class, who talked about that? And that was because of the reversal of the consumptive demand requirement, which made it basically useless until a number of years ago. And so now CBP is aggressively enforcing it in a way that scares brands quite a bit, because what happens, the work release order, if goods are imported and there's some evidence that they've been made with forced labor, and it may be rebuttable evidence, then the goods are held. And they can export them again unless there's a finding, and then they're seized. Brands are freaked out about this. International law firms are all worked up about this. So there's a big focus because the stakes are so high, and they're really uncertain what's going to get stopped. And it could be cotton goods. We saw, medical gloves from Malaysia and a lot of other countries. So the unpredictability of what CBP is doing has brands coming and looking for traceability, and public disclosure as being a part of that more than ever before. And then the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act flips it. You have to affirmatively show that the goods have not been made with forced labor, not just rebut it if somebody has come forth with evidence. So that's changed the landscape in combination with all the new EU due diligence legislation.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to get Damien's question into the mix and then get 1 minute responses on that and the other questions from the panelists.
Thank you. Very quickly, so thank you to all 4 presenters for really interesting papers. I had just a quick question for Mark. The drivers of all of this is this Washington agreement, right? And you say you call these global binding agreements. And I just would like you to say a little bit more about what the binding part of this is. What's the feature of the bindingness in those agreements? Are these legally enforceable sort of commitments through some sort of courts? But how then? Because global agreements is super difficult, I guess, to enforce precisely because of their global or transnational feature. And I was wondering whether this outcome can be attributed precisely to the type of bindingness that might have been enshrined in that particular agreement. Thank you.
Okay, let's then turn to Mark next and also stack up on another question to you, Mark, from Chunyun. Did you notice any spillover effect, like increasing the CBAs in other areas and or industries? Go ahead, Mark.
Great. Wow. So all in a minute. Great questions. Probably have to follow up with some of you afterwards. Anil, the first one, yeah, the key thing to keep in mind is that with CAFTA, you have the yarn forward rules. With yarn forward, you end up with brands setting up textile mills and owning their own factories. So it's not, but you do have Honduran suppliers. So I would love, there is a distributional effect going on. I don't know where it's coming out of. Is it the brand profit margin? Is it consumer prices? Is it efficiency? That I don't know, but there is distribution that goes beyond national borders. With Damien's question, yes, these are legally binding through arbitration mechanisms. In the case of the Washington Agreement, Fruit of the Loom, it has not been used. So the assumption is it's the threat of that possibility. In the case of the Bangladesh Accord, it was used. They went through commercial binding arbitrations, or just like trading partners having a fight with each other. And they consider that very cumbersome. And I know that in detail because I was brought in a couple of cases as an expert. If you look at the international accord, part of the mandate is to find a more efficient binding arbitration mechanism. Lastly, quickly, the spillover effects. I saw the spillover effects with the minimum wage negotiation. They also had bipartite negotiation on a housing subsidy program, and they also had negotiations around COVID relief for all workers. And again, the maquila sector means auto parts, textiles, and garments. And I'll stop there. Thank you for those questions.
Chunyun, how about some reflections from you?
Yeah, thanks for the comments, Anil. Yes, there are several literature that talked about the impact of transparency on people's behavior. Yeah, definitely need to incorporate more of them. In terms of the analysis, yeah, I think the 26 public disclosure standards are core standards. They are more important than others, at least according to better work. So I think that's why then we need to have a longer term of data so that we can see whether this improvement or compliance with these core standards are similar or, like, say, different before or after the disclosure, to tease out the impact of this disclosure effect, or is it just because they are core standards? So I think you're definitely right that we need to do more analysis to show the results of our arguments.
Okay, Ray, the last word goes to you.
Well, thank you. The reason why I love to keep coming to Lyra, aside from seeing this great community, which is really a community I really respect and enjoy, is the great comments. So thank you, Anil, for those comments. Basically, the fixed effects of the countries take care of, I think, 3 of your 5 comments. The factory-specific exports are not separated out. So that's something that would be great for future research. I'd really like to do that. And then thank you very much for the event type study suggestion. I can definitely incorporate that. And I wanted to thank all of you again for the chance to see you and continue the discussion. Thank you all so much.
Thanks. And I really appreciate you guys being so efficient. I look forward to next year when we can have longer sessions and not be so rushed and really enjoy each other's company. So thanks very much. It's been a great session, and that's our wrap.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, next year in person.
Most likely, yeah. Well, it must be by then.
Okay, have fun in London.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Neil. Chunyun, Yanhua, good job. Emily or Bernadette, are either of you there?